Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the penultimate session in our week of webinars, Keeping Faith in the Climate. My name is Rachel and I'm the Faith Outreach Officer at Hope for the Future. Hope for the Future is a climate communications charity which works nationally to equip communities and individuals to communicate the urgency of climate change with their local politicians. We feel it is vitally important that MPs and constituents have rich and challenging conversations about the climate. And we also believe that local grassroots democratic engagement is an essential part of this. This is the last week in our webinar series, and we'd like to thank the European Climate Foundation for making this possible. This week, we're focusing on the role of faith. Today, we're hosting a discussion between the Abrahamic religions on the theology of the earth. We'll end the series tomorrow by looking ahead to the role of faith communities during the build-up to COP26 and how we can encourage the integration of faith with the decision-making that's happening next November. Some housekeeping before we start. Firstly, we'll be recording this webinar, so it will be available on demand for you to watch again and share. We'll be sending all our attendees a follow-up email at the end of the week, directing you to Hope for the Future's latest resources and giving you information about next steps. You can get involved today by posting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and upvoting those questions you'd most like answers to. Please follow us on social media and use the hashtags HFDFwebinar, #CommonHome, or #KeepingFaithInTheClimate. Also on your dashboard will be a chat box. Please don't be shy and use this as a space to introduce yourself and to chat with other webinar attendees during this session. My colleague Emma will be monitoring the chat today. And finally, at the end of the webinar, a feedback form should pop up in your browser. Please don't click exit on this, but take the time to fill it in. It's only short, it's 5 questions, and it's a huge help in our own evaluation. And that means we're on to our discussion today. So today's format is similar to our Monday webinar. We'll have a round of introductions, which will lead into our discussion. We'll move from this into the Q&A before drawing to a close at 5 p.m. With us today, we have Hannah Malcolm, a writer and activist based in Manchester, where she set up one of Christian Climate Action's first regional groups. She's training to be a priest in the Church of England and is writing a PhD on a theological reading of climate and ecological grief. Joining us from the US, we have Dr. Harva Tirosh Samuelson, Regents Professor of History, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and Director of the Center of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. A Jewish intellectual historian, Tirosh Samuelson writes on Jewish philosophy and mysticism, religion, science and technology, and Judaism and ecology. She's the author of 3 books and over 50 essays. And finally, we have Shaheen Ashraf, MBE, Head of Global Advocacy at Islamic Relief Worldwide. Shaheen has been involved in climate policy at an international level, leading on many of the global discussions on gender, faith and climate change, including a strategic dialogue, the Islam and Climate Change Initiative. She's also a counsellor in her local area in the West Midlands. Welcome to each of you and thank you for being a part of our webinar series. Today our topic is the theology of the earth, which is a huge topic for just 1 hour and one we'll do our best to tackle with nuance in as much as that's possible in our allotted time. Theology concerns our outlook and worldview, and it's therefore both a motivating factor and an unconscious determinant in the way that we relate to the earth. The Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam share a common heritage which we'll be exploring today. As a springboard into this discussion, each of our speakers is going to share how they understand the connection between their faith and the environment and introduce both an understanding shared between the faiths, that is the earth as a divine gift, and how their particular faith perspective builds on this. Hannah, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Rachel. It's a real privilege to be with all of you today, and in particular to be sharing a platform with 2 such distinguished speakers in Hava and Shaheen. So thank you both of you for your time as well. I want to start by giving maybe a little bit of background. So I grew up in a devoutly Christian family, and my granddad was a man of committed faith and also a climate scientist. So for him, God's love for the earth and God's love for people were obviously intertwined. And it was surprising to me as a teenager to discover how many Christians didn't believe this. So today I want to suggest 2 theological avenues to help us consider these relationships further. Now, the most fruitful interfaith conversations are, I believe, ones which celebrate both our common ground and also the diversity of our faiths. So I want to suggest one avenue which is shared amongst the Abrahamic faiths and one which is specific to my own Christian tradition. So beginning with a shared principle, though we might express it in slightly different ways, that creation is a divine gift. So we believe God is creator, that creation is both distinct from and constantly upheld by God, and everything that exists is a product of God's creative love. That means it's a gift to be created. And to understand the fullness of this gift, we need to look at it from multiple angles. We as humans are given as a gift to the earth, to its creatures, and to each other. And likewise, the earth and its creatures are given as a gift to us and given as a gift to each other. Now, we like to imagine ourselves as essential or inevitable or independent, but there's no part of creation that is essential or inevitable for God, and no part of creation that is independent of God's loving gift. And I think when we start to see ourselves in this light, which each of our faith teaches, that we're a gift, and as recipients of gifts, we can live lives of gratitude. If we understand each part of creation as both receiving and offering gift, we can also celebrate the diversity of creation in the different gifts offered. And seeing other creatures as gifts is therefore not dependent on whether we can understand them as gifts or not. So we don't get to decide which creatures or places are gifts of God based on whether we personally find them beautiful or useful. So because they exist, we must treat them as a gift. It's not humans who decide whether the earth and its creatures are worthy of flourishing, but the God who made them. And I think this gift lens can also help us to have maybe a shared understanding of how we've sinned. When we refuse to receive God's gift in full, seeing the earth as a gift only to us, not to all creatures, we've failed to understand our calling as a gift to the earth. So we've taken and not given back. And now maybe I'll just briefly introduce a second avenue, a particular way that Christians can understand the earth as sacred. And as I said, I think this is important because it's good to be honest about the diversity of faith, but it's particularly important in this conversation because the Christianized West has been responsible for a lot of the evil perpetrated against the earth in the last 400 years. So my own faith tradition has some specific repenting to do concerning our historic and contemporary violence towards the earth and its creatures, both human and non-human. And I think if we are to repent, we must be willing to disentangle our faith from the trappings of power and greed. And to do so, we have to examine our theology. So we've talked about the earth as sacred because it's God's gift in each of the Abrahamic traditions. But I think Christianity also offers a particular lens through which the sanctity of the earth can be understood. And that would be the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus. So the Christian tradition teaches that God takes on flesh, the dust of the earth, to dwell amongst us, and rises from the dead in a material body which bears the scars of suffering and pain. And perhaps even more mysteriously, we teach that Jesus then ascends to heaven, still fully divine and fully human. So the dust of the earth is taken right into the heart of God. Now, I think if we say we believe this, we must also believe that the earth that God walked on is holy. The world God enters must be good and worthy of healing. As we read in the Gospel of John, God so loved the cosmos, the whole of creation, that he sent his only son. And I think in understanding this, we can see too where we Christians have particularly failed. We've downplayed the physical nature of Jesus's resurrection and the way it affirms the goodness of material creation. An example of that is that we've willfully misread God so loved the world as God so loved people. We've focused on the earth as broken and therefore treated it as something to be discarded rather than something to be healed. We've interpreted our human power as dominance, not service, which is the opposite of how Jesus lived and died. And I raise this because in my personal experience, I think there's been an assumption that happens within Christianity that maybe Christians, we need to reimagine or reinterpret our faith as good news for all creation, and that the message of Christ was originally good news only for humans. But I don't think this is true. I think we're not trying to write a new gospel. We're trying to hear God speak ancient words afresh. And I'm going to finish on that point because I think it's something that each of our traditions share again, that we're hearing God's love for the earth through ancient word and history, and seeking to understand the gift of creation over and over again in each new context that we practice our faiths. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion today, and I'm really looking forward to unpacking some of these themes more.
Thank you for that introduction, Hannah. Dr. Samuelson. Oh, you're still on mute. Sorry.
All right, thank you for including me in this conversation. It's a real honor. I didn't realize that I was supposed to introduce myself more personally, but following the previous example, let me just say that as you can hear from my accent, I'm not an American by birth. I was born in Israel, and I grew up in a kibbutz in Israel, which means that I have a special relationship to the natural world, and I can explore that if people are interested. I approached the topic for today not as a theologian, as our first speaker has done, but rather as a scholar of religion and ecology. So that's a particular subdiscipline or discourse within religious studies. And I was introduced to that discourse, I would say, in the late 90s. And since then, I've been involved in this conversation, which means that I engage the topic as a scholar of Judaism, not so much as an environmental activist, as the other two speakers are. And as such, I try to figure out the various voices within the Jewish tradition and how they either help us understand the ecological crisis, but also in some ways hamper our ability to deal with the ecological crisis. So whatever you say about Judaism is always going to be insufficient or inaccurate for somebody, because it's a very rich and diverse tradition. I would agree that, at least theologically, one foundational belief that is shared both among all Jews and among Jews and Christians as well as Muslims is the notion of creation, or the belief that the world was created by God. And as divine creation, the world belongs to God. And the notion of belonging, I think, is very important here, because it means that the world was entrusted to us, was given to us, not in order to exploit it for our own benefit, but rather in order to till and protect the world. That's the message of Genesis 2:15, which is the second narrative of creation, as people know who are familiar with the biblical narrative. So the question is, how are human beings to care for the world? And I really want to emphasize the word care. According to the second foundational belief of Judaism, the notion of care is not abstract. God actually revealed his will in the form of law, the Torah, and the revealed law itself, the Torah itself, includes instructions how to care for the world. So we're not just lost figuring out what to do. We have some direction in that regard. So revealed law includes instruction of how to care the world, the land, the vegetation, the animals of the world, and the care of the created world illustrates the relationship or the correlation between two main religious principles, justice and holiness. To be holy, one must behave justly toward all created beings. And that includes, of course, the land, vegetables or vegetations, animals, and other humans. When humans behave unjustly toward each other by exploiting them and distorting their rights, then the land cannot tolerate human presence and becomes infertile. And that notion, which already is explored quite well, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, is the deepest insight, I think, of the Judaic tradition. When injustice prevails, according to the biblical narrative, God removes the people from the land and disperses them into exile. The connection between holiness and justice is most evident, especially in the laws of the sabbatical year. In Hebrew, it's called Shemitah, during which the land must lay fallow, and special concern for the poor and the socially marginal is also spelled out. So here is the basic insight. If we treat the earth properly, then it can be fecund, it can be flourishing. But if we don't, then life falls apart. Unfortunately, where we are right now is precisely that moment, that the land can no longer sustain us because of the injustices that are all over us. We are surrounded with injustice, I should say. So the laws of the sabbatical year have evolved over time, but the connection between the care of the earth and the care of the poor, the care of the marginal, the care of the widow, the care of the orphans, that notion is very important and remains the inspiration for a theme in Jewish environmental spirituality, which I will say a little bit more later, called eco-kashrut or eco-kosher. And the point I want to end with is that we cannot seek to be holy or pretend to be holy or aspire to be holy if we don't care for the well-being of the earth and all its inhabitants. So that, I believe, is the basic message of the Judaic tradition to this conversation.
Thank you very much. And finally, Shaheen.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Rachel, Hannah, and Hava. Thank you so much for your insights. I've learned so much already. One of the things that I wanted to kind of speak about, I mean, everybody spoke about their own scholarly discourses and where they're coming from, and I would call myself an ecological reformer from the faith. Probably within Islam, you won't get many Muslim women doing this, but it's also to be able to understand where we are as climate activists within our current space. And something that Hava picked up from Hava is you spoke about natural resources and landscapes as holy and sacred by default. And in Islam, for example, that is something that we concretize within our radical views towards our natural resources and our landscapes, that actually by default, they are holy and sacred, and therefore they are part of God's creation. One of the things that I want to talk about is the kind of what we call in Arabic is the fitra, which is the creation principle. And it's a principle that describes the primordial nature of creation. God's natural pattern on which he made mankind in the Quran, verse 30, Surah 30, verse 29. Mankind was created within the natural pattern of nature and being of it. His or her role is defined by that patterning. Fitra, which is our innate being, is the pure state, a state of intrinsic goodness, and points to the possibility that everything in creation has a potential for goodness, and the conscious expression of this rests with humankind that each of our traditions shares, and which is what I've learned in the last couple of minutes. One of the things that I want to say from the Islamic perspective is that the very earliest Meccan surahs, so of the Quran, invoke nature as proof of God. Be it the water, be it desert, be it trees, the mountains, the sun, the moon, all have their appointed courses. And nature is described as in a constant state of prostration and worship towards its creator. All of nature is enchanted, and it's something that Hannah spoke about earlier, speaking to the glory of God. And so therefore, within Islam, there is an inbuilt and pre-existing obligation of humankind to respect that nature and to use it with caution and with purpose. And the sign and proofs in nature should induce our minds to what the prophetic narrative is, to reflection, to reformation, and to renewal. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, elaborated on this, declaring that the earth as the mother of the believer and the whole earth as a mosque and a space of ritual purity. So within that, there is a well-established tradition in Islam that the whole of the earth is a place of prayer, a sacred space when one might contemplate the divine. Our daily activities, which are thus carried out in this space, require exemplary behavior, as every act is expected to be in nature of a prayer. Prayer and the natural world are irrevocably connected. So when we pray, when we're out and about, we will see that actually you don't need an institution define a place of prayer, that the ecosystem and the land and the greenery around you is that place of prayer. It is the natural world. So naturally, those are both connected. From the Islamic perspective as well, I mean, how we see human species was created in the womb of the natural world in a favorable period in its vast history. The earth rotates on a finely defined axis as an optimal distance from the sun. The ozone layer protects us from the sun's dangerous cancerous radiation. The air then allows us to breathe in a finely balanced mix of gases, while the photosynthesis process produces the oxygen we cannot live without. and the right proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere gives us equitable weather. The tropical rainforests act as massive air conditioners, and we've kind of brought this into what we call the Shara'a, which is the understanding of this within our contextualized framework. And part of that is actually speaking about the moon's orbit controls the tide, and in the temperate zones, the mountains store the winter snows, and all this is actually relayed in the Quran in that sense. So part of the Islamic theology, it doesn't recognize man or woman as living being independent of his or her environment and the laws that operate therein. Islam advocates that physically all ecological factors such as air, water, earth, plants, and animals should support human life. Actually, part of human life is supporting them too. Therefore, our attitudes towards an environment, this environment, is based on the principles of justice, which is what Hava and both Hannah have said, which is called adl in Arabic, wisdom, which is hikmah, and compassion, which is rahmah. And according to the Islamic beliefs, the earth is a sanctuary in which humankind was made to dwell and dwell in comfort. And finally, I just want to end with some might see their ecological understanding as a part of their religion, whereas others see it as separate. A number of us, I guess, experienced individuals who promote an ecologically sustainable way of life for Muslims. We put both our Islamic eco-theology and our ecological knowledge both together, believing that one cannot be separated from the other.
Thank you again for an incredible introduction. There's so much to draw out of what's just been shared in just 5 minutes from each of our speakers. We're going to move on to a question about what the legacy of the Abrahamic faiths has been like over the past 100 years. And I know that that's already been touched on a little bit in those introductions. We'll go in the same order of our speakers. And if our speakers want to make any comments drawing out some of the other things that have been said in the introduction, you're very welcome to do so. Hannah, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose I briefly touched on the ways that, in particular, in the last few hundred years of human history, the Christianized West has been particularly complicit in real tragic and horrifying failings towards the earth and its inhabitants. I think the last 100 years has seen like a sea change in that. There's been increasing desire to repent of those historical failings, to learn to hear the prompting of God from the knowledge of scientists and indigenous peoples and other politically and economically oppressed and marginalized groups. I think that work has begun. Of course, even the Christianized West is a very, very large place. And so, you know, I'm speaking as a Christian in the UK, you know, and so my experience won't necessarily be the same as someone that was speaking as a Christian elsewhere in the West. But I think that movement has begun. But as I said, I think we've often assumed we need to sort of reinterpret or rewrite our faith, which I think means perhaps we've continued to misunderstand some of our own doctrines of creation and resurrection in particular. And of course, when we are considering some of these doctrines, we are always reading them in light of new information. So, you know, the creation narratives take on new life to us with the scientific knowledge that we now have, some of the themes that Shaheen just brought up, and we see them in new ways. But that doesn't mean that the same principles of creation haven't been consistent as more is revealed to us. So I suppose that's one positive direction that I see the Christian faith going in, is looking more broadly for the revelation of God in what we in the Christian tradition call the book of nature, that sits alongside the book of scripture, and a willingness to learn from that.
Thank you, Hannah. Dr. Samuelson.
So, yeah, we are also, the Jewish tradition is also taking the path of reinterpretation and reconstruction of the tradition. I would say that the impetus to this move has been the famous essay, short but very famous essay of Lynn White Jr., 1967. He wrote this, basically an accusation of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that that tradition is at the kind of at the cause, at the root cause of the environmental crisis. And as a result, people, first Jewish theologians and Christian theologians, started to respond and to say, no, you're not really reading the tradition properly. You're actually you're focusing too much on the creation narrative, and you're really forgetting everything after the creation narrative. So that has started this conversation, kind of how to read the legacy of those traditions, whether Judaism or Christianity, more deeply and as well as more broadly. And that what created the field of religion and ecology. Started with kind of hermeneutical conversation and then moved to eco-theology. And now we are actually beyond both eco-theology and hermeneutics. We're doing something much more comparative and much more historical. Now, since the 1970s, I would say that within Judaism, as much as within Christianity and Islam, we have the emergence of religious environmentalism. I cannot tell you that it's a big movement. That would be inaccurate. It is still kind of a sensibility or an approach or kind of an attention. It cuts across all denominations within contemporary Judaism, whether it's Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist, but it's particularly strong among the more liberal versions of contemporary Judaism, especially what is known as the Jewish Renewal movement. They really focus on climate advocacy, on various other campaigns against the extractive or extraction industries, and they pay a lot of attention to social injustice and the connection between environmental decline and social injustice. So that's happening, especially in the Jewish Renewal movement, but practically all other denominations in Judaism experience the same kind of attentiveness. In terms of the principle, I already mentioned the notion of eco-kashrut, so that I think is a good way of linking social justice and eco-justice aspects. And the major insight is that we cannot produce anything unjustly or consume anything unjustly and not expect that there are going to be some kind of repercussions or some kind of ramifications to what we are doing. So I think that in general, Judaism today is attentive to issues such as sustainability, such as social justice, eco-justice, but of course there is a long way to go. So we can talk about that later.
Thank you. And Shaheen?
Well, thank you both. I'm learning so much from both of you. And for me, I think, for example, let me just take my specific around where Islam is in and around this. And I totally agree, Javi, what you said around when you're talking about eco-kasharat, and integrates labor, the whole kind of food supply chain when it comes to things that are tayyib or halal or kosher in your perspective and from our perspective as well. And I really take that on board, because actually that defines the environmentalist pattern and on how we live and how we sustain the earth that we're living in at the moment. But let me just go back from the Islamic construct. In Islamic history, for example, Ottoman civilizations provide us with examples of real seriousness with which Muslims have traditionally taken their environmental obligations. For example, Ottoman viziers or ministers advising the Sultan on matters of administration, policy regularly encouraged moratoria on matters deemed potentially damaging to future generations. So our construct of the Quran is always talking about what would happen in the future if you do not take care of this now. So there's always a defined rhetoric within the Quran that is always telling us about damaging future generations. So an action that is done now will have later effects. Have a look at the cause and effect. And so I'll come back to 100 years ago. And I think one of the other things that I want to probably touch upon is that in this last 100 years, so much has happened. I think Hannah alluded to it earlier on around stuff around, when we look at post-colonialism and all the stuff that nation states were divided and how land is where it is at the moment. And all of that is something that has happened 100 years ago, which has a direct effect on how we deal with whatever it is we're dealing with, particularly, for example, moving on to COP26 and the way nation states are divided, and how we're feeding into national determined contributions and national action plans when it comes to climate change, and how we're looking for funds within that, in that space. But since the late 1960s, Muslim scholars and environmental experts have been adding their voice to a crescendo of religiously inspired call for global action on climate change. It is a movement towards an Islamic eco-theology. However, making those theological formulations, they're relevant to contemporary ecological issues. And Muslim scholars have been engaging in different environmental projects, thereby developing a sense of interconnectedness between his and her surrounding ecosystem. Muslim faith leaders and ecologists and politicians from more than 20 countries gathered at a seminar in Istanbul in 2005, and they launched a unanimously agreed upon Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change, a document that's appealing to 1.6 billion Muslims to take immediate, well-recognized and relevant action against ecological disequilibrium. And this declaration followed a very similar intervention made by the Vatican earlier that year, when Pope Francis issued a 192-page long-awaited encyclical on climate change. So an example of this is when you look at the Islamic tapestry unfolding in its expression over the centuries, Islamic jurisprudence expanded and evolved with this framework to set defining standards for Muslim behavior within the divine decrees of the Quran, including among those family law, civil law, commercial law, and environmental law. And the following are examples of like, for example, the Quran, it says that you have to have faith, be upholders of justice, be bearers witness to God, even if it's against yourself, be they rich or poor, that you look after the environment around you, that you do not deviate from your desires. But, and the earth is part of that narrative as well. So it is a really important point that is being made, but time does not allow us to go into a very deep dive into what has happened in the last 100 years. So understanding it from the Abrahamic tradition and its theological construct will have to be probably on another call. But the point is that where we do need to go into that kind of deep dive to be able to understand exactly what's happened within these last 100 years.
Thank you so much. I think what's really interesting is drawing out this sense of tension between the traditions and richness of these different faiths, which are united in a shared understanding of upholding a particular relationship with the earth, and a celebration of where that's been realised, and also acknowledging some of the complexity and failures and the present concerns that we face. And I think that's leads us into a kind of follow-up question from the discussion that we've just had, which is around what the role of theology is going forward. So how do we use the Abrahamic faith traditions? What role will they have as we look ahead to this next century? And I wonder if I can hand back to Hannah to start some reflections on that.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you so much for those reflections from Hava and Shaheen. I'm learning so much, and in particular, I'm really fascinated to learn that about the Ottoman Empire. My grandmother emigrated to the UK from a Turkish Muslim family, and their last name was Osman. So I'm very excited to learn that from that branch of my family as well, there's this tradition of ecological concern. So thank you for sharing that. In terms of the ways that I see perhaps Christian spirituality or a theological reflection taking us forward, I suppose one of the big themes that I see emerging is this increased interest or embrace in spirituality of creation. And of course that reflects a wider cultural trend, which is that as something diminishes, we realize how much we value it. So as our green spaces diminish, as our access to non-human creation diminishes, we realize how significant it is for our flourishing. And I think that's been true in Christianity. You can see it in things like a revived interest in the monastic traditions and in desert spirituality, for example. And I think this is a really good thing. Just before the seminar, I came from a couple of hours working at a community allotment in my local park. I live in an inner city area, and that's a lifeline for me. But I think it can also, there's also a sort of risk that it can be almost a way of retreating from the suffering of the world, that we retreat into the few green spaces left and perhaps avoid tackling some of these major problems that we've helped perpetrate. So long as our spirituality is feeding us to help us go out and serve, which is the rhythm that the Christian tradition honors in how we understand, for example, what we do when we go to church. We go to church to be fed and then to go out and feed the world. Then I think it can be a positive thing. But I know for myself, there's, you know, like all humans, there's this desire to retreat into the things that comfort us and avoid facing the realities of the suffering that the earth is going through. So those things will need to be held in balance, I think.
Thank you, Hannah. Dr. Samuelson.
Yeah, I don't know what the next 100 years will bring. We are living right now in the midst of enormous uncertainty due to the COVID pandemic. So it's kind of difficult to talk about what will happen 100 years from now when we don't know what will happen tomorrow. But in the forthcoming decades, I think that what's going to happen, and it's already happening, is greater interaction between religious traditions and greater focus on interfaith dialogue that relates to environmental issues. And we have to keep in mind that that's relatively new, and there has been a decline since Vatican II, when there was a movement toward ecumenism. That movement of the 60s and the 70s has been in retreat, and I think that the environmental crisis actually could bring back the religious traditions to seriously interact with each other and share with each other. In general, and we already kind of heard it in what Hannah just said, I think the focus should be on ethics as opposed to on theology, because the theological differences and the symbolic language that undergird that theology, that cannot really change much, but ethics does. What we do can change, and I think that if we share more what members of religious traditions can do together to act about the challenges ahead, we can get a lot done. So to me, the notion of care, or the concept of care, ethics of care should be the focal point. It crosses all traditions. It has a particular gender dimension that can be brought in. I don't have to do it right now, but ethics of care is very useful way of organizing principles, imageries, symbols, ethical directives or instructions in a way that really make us all care more for the world that may not be there in the future. So the way we're going right now in 100 years, we're going to face a lot more desertification, for example. We're going to face, well, we all know the challenges ahead, and unless we do something now, nothing will change, or it only will get worse. So now is the time. I would end by saying, if not now, when? So we need to do it right now, and this kind of conversation that we have across religious traditions is crucial to our collaboration and cooperation.
Thank you. And finally, Shaheen.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's something that Hava has just said, and she speaks about what we call refracting through a lens of Islam, and she's mentioned a lot of stuff around interreligious and interfaith kind of collaboration could lead to this unique contribution to the synthesis of ideas that we all have. But I see that we are at some kind of impasse. For example, if I again look at specifics, for example, Muslim groups in the West are re-examining alternative currencies and ways of trading, like, for example, those are based on the fiqh of Islam. So, I mean, when it comes down to it, the Quran specifically speaks in Surah 30, verse 40, it speaks about corruption has appeared in both land and sea because of what people's own hands have brought about, so that they may taste something of what they have done, so that they will hopefully turn back. For us, this is a direct message from God in talking to us about the fact that the world is facing absolute unprecedented changes. We're being brought, and this pandemic itself, whether it's from the UK context or others, we can see that it's been brought to the brink of destruction by a nexus of capitalism, let's not forget colonialism and consumerism, which has happened in the last 100 years, but will continue if we don't understand. And I think this pandemic has actually brought about a sea change of where we are as human beings. And it has allowed us to have that spiritual connection with our creation and with our creative environment as well. So we believe that as communities, and not just as communities, as Muslim communities, that we have the moral duty and the philosophical tools not only to adapt to this oppressive reality, but to actually transform it and to overcome it in the name of ethical eco-liberation, and something that Hava spoke about earlier. And in this ethical eco-liberation, we should also focus on addressing, I think that, and one of the things that has been brought about, particularly around the climate change narrative, is around looking at the absolute vast amount of addressing racial and economic inequalities that together we can change when it comes to issues around climate change. So, I mean, we would think about reconsidering consumption and sustainability from an Islamic perspective, in particular, establishing some kind of radical reform methodology that will set out applying this lens to the issue of sustainable consumption, because we cannot continue to be like this. We cannot look back and look at the legacy of extraction and then say nothing else needs to be done. We have to have alternative currencies to be able to deal with what is being set out within the near future.
Thank you. I think that's a really great acknowledgement from all of our panelists there, as an acknowledgement of where we are and what needs to happen in terms of change, both in that sense that Dr. Samuelson mentioned about focusing on ethics and the things that we do differently, and Shaheen just then talking about the responsibility that we need to take within our own context and in this religious context. I'm just going to open up, before we move into the Q&A, a chance for our speakers to respond to one another and maybe talk a little bit more about some of the different topics that have been touched on. I can see that Hannah's unmuted herself, so I'm going to take that as a sign that she'd like to speak.
Yeah, I just want to kind of reiterate what Shaheen was just saying, that I think perhaps one of the gifts of our faith traditions that we have to offer at this time is that, we are part of a much more ancient story than something like capitalism or colonialism or extractivism, that there's a sense in which we treat the way things are now as an inevitable state of things, that there's no way out. But we know that's not true. We tend to have quite short-term memories in our public and political discourse about what is possible. But I think one of the gifts of faith traditions is that we have much longer memories. Part of our faith practice is to rehearse stories which are very, very ancient and to say that they have powerful relevance for today. So one of the ways that we have something to offer is by saying, we don't believe this is inevitable. We don't believe that this is how things have to be. And we can provide vision. So I think one of the challenges in our dialogue is moving away from simply outlining the things that are wrong and moving towards outlining what the good looks like, what a good, healthy earth looks like, what good relationships look like. And that's something that I think faith traditions, and in particular, faith traditions in collaboration, have to offer.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to come in on that?
Yeah, I would like to add a word that we haven't mentioned so far, and that's the word science, because a lot of the conversation or a lot of the challenges that we need to deal with has to do with the response to scientific information about what's awaiting. So one of the problems that we have right now is the notion that scientific discourse is necessarily secular. So I refer particularly to the discourse on the Anthropocene, the vision or kind of the claim that humans have become shapers of the physical environment in a new way. So there's a debate, when did it all start? Did it start in the Industrial Revolution, or did it start in the 1950s? But whatever it is, and I'm not going to resolve those issues, I think the assumption is that religion is irrelevant, and that assumption needs to be challenged. I think that religion is very relevant to the Anthropocene discourse, and we have in that, I truly agree with what Hannah just said, we need to show that our deepest spiritual, ethical kind of impulses are very relevant to how the future will be unfolding. We don't know how it will be unfolded, but we do know that if we do certain things like fill the oceans with plastics, it's going to be a bad idea. So we need to kind of figure out a way to enter this conversation with environmental scientists and with other kind of scientists, especially physicists, and show that religion is not just a bunch of bunch of nonsense, but rather something that is very deep and very pertinent to the challenges ahead. And the only way to do it is to do it together, because if individuals do it without collaboration and cooperation, it's going to be very difficult to make some kind of an impact on the scientific discourse. So that's the challenge for the next at least 50 years, if not more.
It is quite a challenge. And Shaheen, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with both speakers. I think there has to be a full assertion of faith as a solution, and it shouldn't be constrained by context. That's right. In other words, like, for example, the Quran talks about, learning about your mistakes and changing your ways. We have, as a Muslim community, if we think we have 1.6 billion people, it's about how to engage them on issues around consumption, consumerist habits, behaviors, and all the other kind of things. And so therefore, it's important for our faith community to both engage in the debate concerning the environmental crisis and at the same time work in partnership with other faith traditions and like-minded groups, as well as scientists from outside of the world of Islam. And I think this is a really important kind of thing to say. For example, at the root of crisis in the Muslim context it could be around personal behaviors. And, we have to be true to ourselves and understand that the spontaneity that we have and the inclination that we have to prioritize the welfare of others by whom they share a little finite planet. For example, when we see something happening around, it's Harvard said something about it earlier about climate-induced migration. That's exactly what my work is around, looking at environmental patterns and looking at projecting what will happen within 10 years in various parts of the land in order to be able to understand where the tradition of aid delivery would be taking place. So it's about understanding that actually that we should have cared interests of the generations to come. Part of that is that understanding our community need to understand around Islamic environmentalism, and it begins with the self, and it goes back to the very first construct of the fitrah, and then it radiates to the home, the school, the mosque, and the wider community, and to all humankind. So for us, there is absolute possibilities, endless possibilities for kind of activism, Muslim activism in the common struggle to save the planet. Once ecological issues are seen in the light of giving service in the world created for us by an act of divine love, which is the act of divine love from God. So I believe that absolutely so much progress can be made if both Muslim countries and individual Muslims themselves take the environmental heritage of their faith so much more seriously. And I want to touch upon the fact that, climate change and racial injustice are both deeply intertwined as well, and the transition to probably looking at a low carbon future is connected to worker rights and all the other kind of stuff. That's the work that I come from. But absolutely, there has to be transformational reform from within ourselves and the wider world in that sense. And I think that there is that. And out of that must arise an ethic of liberation, a kind of a radical reform. And we use the two books. And it's interesting, Hannah, you spoke about the two books. We speak about the Quran and the Book of Nature too. So I'll end on that note.
Thank you. I'm going to move over to Q&A. I'm going to try and be democratic and just take the ones that are most upvoted. And the first of those is from Tasha, who asks about living environmentally friendly lifestyles and how that's often been packaged as something that's only accessible to those who can afford it. So she asks, what do each of the panelists' faiths say about making this an affordable way to live and making it accessible for everyone? Hannah, do you want to speak?
Yeah, so very briefly, it's important to begin by acknowledging that those who are on lower incomes or are living in poverty already have very, very low impact lifestyles. So basically, it's a very smooth curve between the more wealth you have, the larger your carbon footprint. Okay, so if you're very wealthy and you drive an electric car, you will still have a larger carbon footprint than someone who has half your income and drives a petrol car. So that's just the way it is. So the wealthier you are, the greater your carbon footprint. Now, I think the kind of question behind that point is, you know, environmentally friendly lifestyles are ones which I think are for the flourishing of people. Okay, so having access to green spaces, being able to eat healthy food, living in clean environments, being able to have areas to exercise, you know, living simply, those are good things. And the question is, why are those things most accessible for those who have more wealth? And the Christian tradition has a great deal to say about systemic injustice, and we can see this as a justice issue. So, you know, I live in an inner city area of Manchester. There's not very many trees around. It's not a green space. If you go to the wealthier neighborhood next door, it's a lot more green. So I think Christianity will have this in common, perhaps, with Judaism and Islam, that the God's justice for the poor in particular, and God's solidarity with the poor is a consistent theme that we can draw on to look for structural change, not just personal lifestyle change.
Thank you. Do either of our speakers want to comment? Oh, Dr. Samuelson.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what we just heard. I would like to suggest that we need to change our attitude toward consumption. So we have all become consumers, and we live consumerist lifestyle, and that can change. Changing that attitude, I think, is doable. And it, you know, I agree that the wealthier you are, the more problematic you are as far as environmental behavior is concerned. So we simply need to do things differently, and I think that we will. The COVID pandemic really will force changes that we cannot even fathom. And next point I would like to suggest is urban gardening. In other words, a lot can be done within an urban environment to change how people think about what's around them. How to introduce permaculture into the places where we live. So that can be done right now. It's not going to change our maybe carbon footprint, but it can definitely help in terms of eating better, and just looking at nature differently. If we're not surrounded with cement, but rather with green, that would make a change in how we look at the environment. And finally, in terms of the principles, I would like to highlight, I already mentioned care. The other word that goes with it is responsibility. If our educational system focuses on care, on the principle of care and on the principle of responsibility, we can get an awful lot done. Environmentalism needs to start very early on. Environmental education should start at least from kindergarten or at least from first grade. And if we teach our children to think in those terms, we can make a lot of change. So I'm kind of hopeful in terms of the possibility.
Thank you. I think what Hannah said brought us really nicely onto the next follow-up question, which, if you're answering, you might want to just give a brief explainer for those people who aren't familiar with this concept. But there was a question about Jubilee, which was, it's such a fantastic idea, why has it not been taken up and applied? Did any society ever live by it? Do we have anybody willing to speak to that?
Excuse me, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. The question is about the idea of Jubilee.
The Jubilee?
Yes.
Okay. I couldn't. Yes, so the idea of Jubilee is difficult because it's about debt relief, in a sense. Every 50 years, the idea is that the land goes back to God. In a sense, we have to start from scratch. And we have to let go of all the debt that has been accumulated. Obviously, if you're a bank, you're not going to be very happy with that principle. In other words, if you are the creditor, that creates a challenge for creditors. So how can we find a balance between making wealth available? No, it's not about wealth, but making resources available to the community and ensuring that people are not going to be devastated by the gift that they, or by the loan that they are given. So that has been very complicated. Both Judaism and Islam, of course, deal with that. I don't know that I have a good solution, but I do like the notion of micro-lending. So I know that in certain parts of the world there have been very concrete ways of doing it. I think that the way we lend money now, interest rates, the whole credit industry needs to be rethought in order to make it more just and more equitable. Because people right now are basically destroyed by capitalism. So capitalism will have to change the way it does business. And I think actually COVID-19 may be pushing us in that direction. So we'll see what happens. Right now, without support, in the United States, it's support from the government primarily, we can cope with a crisis. So I think that that's going to change the way we think about the connection between economy and well-being. But the Jubilee, just to end, the Jubilee is more an aspiration at this point rather than a system that is being lived by. So maybe Shaheen could say something more about microlending in Islam, because it's not a coincidence that the system was invented in Islamic societies rather than elsewhere.
Thanks, Hava. I think that's going to, talking about micro-lending is going to take another hour. So I probably won't touch upon that topic. But yes, you are right. Micro-lending in Islam is a very major thing that we do as part of our work at Islamic Relief worldwide as well. The other thing I did want to touch upon is Jubilee. And I know Islamic Relief was heavily involved in the Jubilee debt campaign earlier on, when we were asking for the debt to be cancelled for Pakistan. Again, it had a lot of political, complications when we were asking one particular country and not others, because with it comes also adapting to their policies. And within they are one of the countries that actually lives by various jurisprudence laws as well. So it's about actually not just tackling the debt campaign, but everything else that comes with it. So there is this kind of growth of, right, let's talk about the human rights element of this now, and let's go to the next stage, and let's go to the next stage, because debt primarily is part of the wider global economy, who cancel out whose debts and all this other kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I like the campaign. I was very much involved in the campaign. I will continue to be in the campaign against, cancelling debt. And I believe it is fair. It needs to be done. However, at the same time, I would like more funding to go into the green climate finance so that we can do more stuff with bringing poorer communities out of, the current situations that they're in.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time. So I'm going to hand over back to each of our panelists to say a final word or reflection that they would like all of our attendees to leave with, and then I'll just finally wrap up. Hannah, we'll start with you again.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose one thing I've tried to emphasize is that I think the tools we need to reorient ourselves towards the earth and our fellow creatures are ones we already have within our faith histories. And we've talked quite a lot about interfaith dialogue. And I want to also just add that, as has been touched upon, we will need intra-faith dialogue. So we are part of enormous faith traditions with very diverse perspectives and practices. And really, the work that each of us are involved in is also what it means to dialogue within our faiths in order to bring about change. And to do that, we're going to have to, adopt an attitude of humility and listening, and being willing to perhaps reorient our perspective as to who we're willing to learn from. So, for example, within the Christian tradition, the overwhelming majority of Christians don't live in the minority world, in the wealthiest part of the world. The majority of Christians are already having to survive the effects of climate breakdown, are already experiencing huge climate trauma in their communities. And so that needs to also be what shapes our perspective, which voices from where in the world we listen. So both interfaith and intrafaith dialogue will be part of what a sustainable future looks like.
Thank you, Hannah. And Dr. Samuelson.
Yes, I agree with what Hannah just said. I would like to leave the audience with three words. One is we all need to be literate in our own tradition. So literacy would be one. We have a lot of resources within our traditions, but most people are just not aware of the resources in their own traditions. So we've got to teach those traditions well enough to our people so they can see that it's all there. So literacy is number one. The second point is openness to the other. And that's getting harder and harder, especially in the United States, in an environment of polarization and hatred. But it's all over the world. So how to remain open to difference without canceling the difference or erasing the difference, that's a major challenge for the future, but I think we can do it precisely if we come from a spiritual tradition. And the third word is hope. How to keep our hope alive in times which are quite dark and even frightening. So I think, again, it only comes, I think hope can come from engaging the tradition, from teasing out or exploring the possibilities within the tradition. And if we keep that, remain literate, remain open, and remain hopeful, then the future will be pretty good. Then we can thrive, and then we can really enjoy the bounty and the gift that we have called our world.
Thank you, and Shaheen.
It seems as though Dr. Hava has taken my 3 points, but anyway, I feel as though she's seen my notes, but she hasn't. But just a real, 3 things that I want to pick up on, and it's what both of our speakers, Hannah and Hava, have already said, that the Abrahamic traditions and other traditions, they can be an absolute realization for us. For example, it's, the opening passage of the Quran, the Fatiha, which is a similar construct to the Lord's Prayer. In that there is a reform lens that can be adopted and taken as a helpful tool, which provides a means to tackle a contemporary topic such as consumption, when you really delve down into that. And so that is what Hava spoke about around religious literacy. And for me as well, and for us as Muslims and people in general, as part of this eco-liberation climate change movement, to separate those things that are impossible with the possible. And the truth is that the climate justice movement should involve people of color, should have indigenous people, should always be worked on with a multidimensional lens, because we have to fight on so many different planes. And I think that this is a moment for all of us to start thinking internally about some of the challenges that we ourselves are having. And I think it's a moment for introspection and a moment to start thinking about how we want to contribute to a system and join forces. And that's touching upon Hannah's point about the interreligious and interfaith dialogue that you were talking about. And I think my last point is that all of this, for me, from a Sufistic stroke, a spiritual perspective, it brings a unique spiritual and ethical urgency to the environmental question. We will also be like other climate activists, and I see that actually we need to be pragmatic, we need to be pluralistic, we need to understand the decolonial, and also be active in all our communities in order for us to make that change.
Thank you. We've sadly run out of time. A huge thank you to all of our attendees for coming today, and to our panelists for their excellent contributions. Do join us tomorrow. We'll be considering the role of UK faith communities in the build-up towards COP26. Please do also get in touch with Hope for the Future if you'd like to arrange a conversation about engaging a faith community that you're a part of at an event or with meeting their MP. And finally, please do fill out the feedback form that's going to pop up as you exit this session. We look forward to seeing you soon, hopefully tomorrow at the same time. Take care. Bye.